Hey, I'm Kelly Minter, and I want to invite you to join me for my new Bible study, Esther. Over 7 sessions, we'll explore the daring faith modeled by Esther and her cousin Mordecai, and we'll also see how God calls us to live out the same faith through our everyday circumstances. We'll dive deep into a book of the Bible where God's name is never mentioned, but where he is clearly at work among his people. And we'll be reminded that the transforming power of God seen in Esther is the same power at work in our lives today through Jesus Christ. Darkness becomes light, mourning becomes celebration, and death becomes life. I cannot wait for you to join me for this study. You can learn more at lifeway.com/Esther study. That's lifeway.com/Esther study.
This is the Marked Podcast from Lifeway Women. Each episode, we'll talk about what God is doing, how he has and is marking each of us. We're so glad you've joined us today. Hello and welcome to the Mark Podcast. I am Elizabeth Heineman and I am here today with 2 people and we all went to the same college. So just a shout out to Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. I can say confidently that we all had a great time there and would sing its praises even to this day. Dearest Union, as our song says. First of all, I want to introduce Ashley Veneman. Ashley works at Lifeway with me, and so she's going to co-host this episode. We've had some visiting co-hosts this season. And Ashley, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for Lifeway.
I work for B&H Publishing on the book side. So I work with marketing to where once our authors are acquired and we're ready to get their book out into the world, we just work with our authors and get their books in front of the right people. So I love what I do. And yes, I did love Union, but we will all spare any listeners from singing that alma mater.
I don't know it, so that is another way that we will spare them. I only know the Union, Dearest Union part.
That's all anyone knows.
Yes. All right. And then we're joined today by Kristen Lowry, who is all the way in Kenya. So this is a very international episode. We're so excited to have you here, Kristen.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
Tell us about yourself and your family and your ministry.
Yeah, so I live outside of Nairobi, Kenya. I'm here with my husband, who is God's grace in my life. He's wonderful. And we've got 5 kids, 4 of whom are still at home. I have kind of dual roles. So on one hand, I work for Send Relief as their international orphan care consultant. And on the other hand, I serve as the co-executive director of Shelter Yetu, which is a local organization here that works with street-connected children.
Very cool. And tell us about Send Relief, because some of our listeners may be familiar with that organization, but some may not be familiar with Send Relief. And it is a great organization that I would love for all of our listeners to understand what Send Relief does.
For sure. So Send Relief is it's basically cooperation between the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention and the North American Mission Board. And we're responsible for helping churches carry out the Great Commission through Ministries of Compassion. So whether that's missionaries on the field, doing projects to serve the communities around them, or in the States, we have, Send Relief centers across the nation. We're just kind of trying to be the hands and feet of Jesus for Southern Baptists and with Southern Baptists. One of our focus areas is protecting children and families, which is kind of where my work falls under, is orphan care and protecting children and families.
And we'll talk more about that for sure. A lot of our listeners may have heard about Send Relief through their disaster relief programs. I know a lot of natural disasters, Send Relief is there. They're like one of the first people there. It's like the American Red Cross and Send Relief. And so You may have seen that when there is a natural disaster that strikes your area, you may have seen Send Relief trucks set up. And so that is what they do, a lot of what they do here in the States. But then, like Kristen said, they also do work around the world and caring for the vulnerable as well.
Kristen, one of the things, I love what you're saying too when you mention that it's a part of the IMB and how it is a bridge between the church and then also just individuals. But can you go into that a little bit more of how does Send Relief work with churches to help care for orphans around the world? Because when we're thinking about how do we get involved or how does our church get involved, what does that process look like?
So it's kind of a big question. So my background is in journalism. I studied with you at Union photography and journalism, and then came out to Kenya as a photographer. And so I was doing photography for the IMB, and one of the last assignments I did during my journeyman term was a young university student who was feeding street children. So in Kenya, I don't know, between 200,000 and 300,000 kids are living on the streets. And this young lady was just buying some bananas and going and sharing the word of God and kind of getting to know these kids. So I took pictures, and I was really excited because I knew like the Lord was going to use these pictures to call some people to come work with the kids. And then what happened was I went home. I was living in South Africa at the time, and the Lord like would not let me rest. When I slept, I thought about these kids. When I was eating food, I thought about these kids. When it was raining, I thought about these kids. And eventually I just asked the Lord, like, are you calling me to work with these children? And there was kind of an immediate peace. And so I was like, oh, I thought you were going to call someone else. So I ended up back in Kenya working with street kids and kind of hoping for a way to serve a lot of street kids. It's a really long story, but I ended up living with that same young lady downtown Nairobi, helping kids. And eventually kids were living in our living room, which is not best ministry practices, but that's just, it's kind of how it ended up. Like we had a kid who had major surgery. And then when he came off of the medicines, they were like, well, where are you going to take him? And you can't take a kid who, you know, has just come off a major surgery and put him on the street. So he ended up in our living room. And we were praying this whole time that the Lord would open up a door for us to be able to minister better to these children. And in 2013, the Lord gifted me with an orphanage. And so I ended up working with these kids through an orphanage for a number of years. And basically through that experience, kind of learned about best practices and how to care well for orphans. And what I realized was that while a lot of us really have hearts to care for kids, we really want to answer that James call of caring for widows and orphans. We don't necessarily know how to do that in another context. And so I was seeing a lot of churches that were coming over and visiting orphanages or building orphanages, supporting them with their money. And what I came to realize was a lot of these kids had families. And so I approached the IMB and said, I want to be an advocate for these kids and also for churches that want to serve them well. Because I think, you know, we act out of a heart to serve these kids. And so from that was born this role where I'm stepping in and I'm helping Southern Baptist churches, missionaries, and then just on the ground organizations and practitioners with how to care well for orphans, which in most cases actually means trying to get them back with family.
Right.
That was a long answer.
No, that's great. And I was just thinking, like, a lot of women, like you said, have this heart for orphans, but are not sure exactly what they can do in their homes, in their churches, in their lives here in America. Maybe most of our listeners are in America, not all of them, but most of them. And so what can the average woman who's listening to this podcast right now, who is like, I would love to help, but like, I can't move to Kenya. So what can I do to help these orphans around the world right now?
Yeah, I think for me, the most important thing is that you can become well-informed. So the kind of shocking statistic when you kind of dig into the data is that 80% of kids in orphanages have families that would like to care for them. Actually, 80% have a living parent.
Wow.
More than 95% have families that would love to care for them. And that's not only what the statistics say, but that's my practical experience. So when I inherited that orphanage, I was told by the community that, you know, these are the least of the least. They don't have anyone in the world. And then what happened was that as we were getting to know the kids, kind of hearing their stories, I asked this kid, he was erasing the chalkboard, end of the day, school lessons were over. And I was just like, I'm so sorry what happened to your mom. And he looked at me with this huge grin and he tells me she was here on Saturday. And I was like, what? And what had happened was that he had been separated from her when there was post-election violence back in 2007 in Kenya. And she had been displaced from her community and felt like she couldn't provide for all of her kids. Mm-hmm. So she went around and put them in different orphanages in the same city, knowing that if they were there, they would get education, they would get food, they would get medical care, but they would lack the love of a mother, which, you know, as women and as moms, we understand that it is actually a need for children. They need that strong attachment to a parent. So in this particular instance, we were able to get 40 out of 50 kids home within a year and back into families. But that's kind of the prevailing statistic around the world. And so what I would tell women in churches is dig into that, kind of learn what that situation is, especially if you give to an orphanage, if you visit an orphanage, if you're connected in any way. Just start asking those questions. There's a website called Faith to Action that has really great resources as far as the statistics, what you can ask. It has a Bible study that you can use to kind of dig into the subject and learn more about God's heart for orphans. But I think what we can do is understand and advocate for these kids. The hard thing that somebody asked me once a few years ago was, imagine your kid. Like I said, I had 5 kids. And imagine if you and your husband were to pass away, where they would go. And so I began thinking about that. And of course, they would go to my sister or my mom or my husband's sister or his mom. And that person asked me, how many times would I have to ask you that question before you would say an orphanage? Mm-hmm. And it kind of hit home that there's no circumstance that I can think of that I would want my kids in an orphanage. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that makes me realize that sometimes the solutions that we're thinking of for other kids are not necessarily the ones we want for our kids. And so we might need to rethink the best solution for those kids and become advocates for them in the States, because we do better when we know better. I think that's true of all of us. Yeah. And so to have that information and to share that information widely and to use your circles of influence to advocate for these kids, I think is something very practical that you can do. And if anyone is interested, they're welcome to get in touch with me. I'll provide them with, a number of resources to do that.
Hey friends, this is Ellie Holcomb, and I'm so excited to invite you to join me and the Lifeway Women for an Advent Bible study, Joy to the World. I'll be leading you in song each week, and my friends at Lifeway Women have created video devotional content, personal study in the Bible study book, family devotions, Advent activities, and more. We can't wait to celebrate the good news of great joy found in the Christmas story with you this Advent season through this new study. Learn more at lifeway.com/joy to the world.
Yes, and we'll put that Faith to Action website in our show notes as well, and we'll have all of that information in our show notes. So if you're listening right now, you don't have to worry about writing it down while you're driving. We will have that on the Lifeway Women blog is where you can find our show notes, and so you can find those either through your podcast app or on the Lifeway Women blog.
One thing that strikes me so much, Kristen, knowing you and for a long, long time, your heart has been towards just helping those around you pretty much ever since I have met you. But one of the things I would love, and I think it goes right into what our question was as well, like Elizabeth said, for those that can't go overseas or that's not a part of God's plan for them right now. You were involved in helping people when you lived in Memphis. You immersed yourself in the community when you lived here. I mean, you were living out what you are doing now, even right where you were. Can you talk about that a little bit, about just even your time? You were always looking for just where was the need in the city that God had planted you. And sometimes that's domestic, sometimes that's international, but I told so many people just about how God has used you wherever you've been planted because you've been willing and obedient to just the needs around you. So I know that sounds like a loaded question, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you've done, like domestically too, that even made that to where it was just kind of a natural step to do the same thing internationally.
Well, that's really gracious of you. First of all, I take that as a high compliment from Ashley Veneman. Yeah, so I finished university and I was in the UK. I was doing an internship there in journalism, and visas didn't work out, so I ended up back in my home city of Memphis. And this is all like completely God, because I was freelancing for the local paper and I was living at home, and my parents were like, why did I just spend that much money on a Union University education for you to be sitting in our living room and coloring books? And I was like, yeah, that's a good point.
And those of us with the creative writing degrees, yes. My parents also asked me that too.
You can relate.
It came around for both of us, it sounds like.
For sure. So I had a friend who had worked with refugees, and she lived in kind of a lower income area of Memphis. And to be honest, all I knew about where she lived was that I could afford the rent. It was incredibly affordable. And that the pizza delivery would not come to that part of the city.
Okay.
And with only that information, I moved in and completely saw the hand of God. There was a group of 7 or 8 of us that had all kind of moved into this area for different avenues of ministry, some to work in a neighborhood school, some to work with refugees, just kind of different things. And the Lord kind of knit us together in this really strong community. And that community was, it was just incarnational life and ministry. There were 7 of us living in this old duplex and had kind of just committed to each other to pray and to walk together. And the Lord really blessed that in that community. We had deep relationships with all of our neighbors. Our house was kind of the community hangout for all the kids. So any summer afternoon, you might find 10 or 15 kids there having a dance party or a Bible study or any number of things. And it just really, it prepared me for life in the majority world, I think. That kind of communal living and hospitality are things that are really important here, but also just kind of that learning to live in community and to sacrifice and to serve those who are around you was just really formational for me. Like the Lord was just really gracious in that experience, because I told people during that time in my life or shortly after, like before I had heard about Jesus, but living in intentional Christian community, I kind of experienced Jesus, and that's continued to be the case even here. Living among other believers and in community. So,
and I think it's so beautiful too that season of your life you were single and you were still a mother to those around you. So when you're talking about just orphans, it has nothing to do with a marital status.
Right.
It has everything to do with just having a heart that is for those around you. And so that's why I just love all of the seasons of just how God's used you in your life.
I never know the order of these episodes coming out, but we just had a conversation with the Ortlands the other day. So I don't know if that episode, if this is a preview or a like postscript to that episode when you're listening to this. But the Ortlands, we were talking about like leaving a legacy of faith and how that does not necessarily, that's not just inclusive to or exclusive to those who are married and have children, biologically have children. It is also like Janie Ortland was like, if you don't have kids of your own, find some kids. And so it sounds like you did that, Kristen. You just found some kids
100%.
that were around, and you are part of their faith journey as a
and I didn't grow up in the church.
Yeah.
And so it was those women in church, Sunday school teachers and small group leaders who really discipled, but also just loved on me in significant ways. And anyone can fulfill that role. There's always kids around that are hungry for affection and relationship. I think especially in today's world with technology and kind of the isolation that can bring. But reaching out to kids within the church, within the neighborhood, I think that's always so deeply valuable. And we won't know the impact of that, I think, until much later.
And I think that's something that we can all do, no matter where we live, no matter what our community looks like. We can still be the hands and feet of Jesus by serving, by opening our homes to people, to opening our yards, and just having that be just, hey, I know this lady that lives in this house, or I know this family that lives here, and they're always ready to receive people. They're ready to help out. They're ready to loan out their car or a cup of sugar or whatever it is so that we can all thrive in our community.
Yeah, and even, I mean, this may seem obvious, but foster care, there's so many kids in the States in foster care, and to be able to walk beside those children and their families as they're walking through a tough season, to kind of, minister to both of them, I think is a beautiful expression of the gospel that, we never participated in our time in the States. But I just have so much respect for people that do, and think that that's always a good opportunity.
Yes. And there's ways to do that even without the full commitment, because there's a lot of people who can't be full-time foster parents, but you could be a CASA worker. You could be a relief, respite care for foster kids who, or you can just support the foster families that are in your
even
church.
Just making a meal or buying some back to school clothes,
doing laundry,
anything like that.
Cleaning out their garage, those kinds of things. There was a Sunday at my church where we talked about how to support foster families, and one of the members of our church is a foster mom, and she was like, I just need somewhere to store all of these like bikes and clothes that have been donated to me, and I love them, but my foster kids can't wear them right now, but I don't want to get rid of them because you never know who you're going to have. So she was like, if you have an attic if I could just use your attic. And I was like, that is such a like very specific but tangible and easy thing to commit to. Like, yeah, I've got an attic. You can use it.
For the glory of God,
Yes,
use my attic.
exactly. So I think just asking them and being like, what is a very easy, tangible thing that you need that would not seem so simple to you would be a great blessing to you. And so
That's right.
yeah, getting creative. But I love that. Well, you talked a little bit about this, about how your experience there prepared you for like cultural norms in Kenya, maybe. But this is maybe a little more of a fun question, but we don't have a huge listening audience in Kenya. So it's most likely a foreign place for a lot of our listeners. And do you have any fun or interesting stories of like culture shock or trying to fit in a new place that's different from the U.S.?
So I came to Kenya as a rather young adult. So I came when I was like 23. So most of my adult life has been here. And the most striking sort of culture shock was the first Christmas I was here. No, the second Christmas I was here, I went home with my friend Eunice to her village. And we were preparing the Christmas dinner. We were out in the like hut, the kitchen hut with like the fire and all of this stuff. And her mom gave me a tomato and was like, "Can you just chop this up?" And I look over and her 4-year-old sister is chopping a tomato on her hand with a sharp knife. And I was like, I can't chop a tomato without a cutting board.
Yeah.
And it was just so incredibly humbling to be like, oh, none of the skills that I thought I had from my, fancy university education are helpful right now. Like, I am literally less helpful than a 4-year-old. So it was good and humbling. And then also when I was studying Swahili in Tanzania, they were asking about disciplining children. At the time, I just had one kid. And so they were asking, like, we know that Americans don't discipline their kids. We discipline our kids. And so I was talking about, like, how I had seen other parents discipline their kids. And in Kenya, I had seen them pinch, like, not hard, but, just give a little pinch to a child who was misbehaving. And so I was talking about that, and their faces became, like, just horrified. And I was like, oh, my gosh, what am I saying right now? And apparently the word in Kenya for pinch is the word for skin in Tanzania. Like you.
Oh, no.
And so I was like, oh, no, what have I done? So I explained, no, that is not how I think you should discipline a child.
It's a lost
yeah,
information. That's not something you want.
Yes.
So yeah, mostly embarrassing things that I've done in Kenya is what I've got here, apparently.
I feel like anytime there's a language barrier, it is just like,
Not good.
that is going to create some awkward situations no matter what.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Sometimes funny
sure.
and sometimes more horrifying. Kristen knows this, and we were talking about this right before we started the episode, but my husband and I, when we were dating, Justin lived in Kenya. He was a journeyman doing photography, just like Kristen started. And I just will never forget, like, Skyping with him while we were dating. And the thing that I couldn't get over was how many lizards were in this man's house. So we would be talking, and then he would just be like, hold on one second. And then I'd just hear boom. And then he's like, I just killed a lizard. I mean, they were just everywhere, apparently. And I just thought, your day is different than mine. And so it was just always so many things that, I don't know, were just the norm. But he absolutely loved his time in Kenya. But I think so many people picture one aspect of something. And still in our house, we have photographs that he took when he was living in Nairobi. But you live in like a place that's so modern in some areas. And then you could just go just a couple of miles and then you're like, well, there's a giraffe and just crossing a road. So it's just things that
it is really wild. Yeah.
It's beautiful there though. And so can you talk a little bit about just kind of what it looks like there? Just that what things are like right next to each other, like just that juxtaposition of a safari next to a grocery store.
For
almost.
sure.
So,
Yes, it is. It is. When my kids come to the States, they get really super excited about squirrels, like screaming, wanting to take pictures. Mom, look at that. It's a squirrel. But we have monkeys in our backyard and it does not faze them. They're like,
Right.
the monkeys are always stealing the carrots from the garden. And so it is on one hand, like that's very, I don't know, what you would maybe stereotypically think about Africa. On the other hand, like we shop at a mall and there's tons of traffic. We're the only city in the world where there's a national park. So you have lions and rhinos and giraffes like right next to the city. Like you can see them on the highway coming from the airport.
Wow.
which is a little bizarre.
That's so cool.
But yeah, it's a wonderful place. I really love Kenya with all my heart.
I recently discovered that my neighborhood hosts a animal rescue, and so we have both squirrels and monkeys like in
Nice.
my neighborhood. And
Wow.
I've lived there, I don't know, like 10 years, and just discovered this the other day. And I was like, my neighbors, I was taking a walk and my neighbors were like, "Do you hear the monkeys?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And they were like, "Yeah, there's monkeys over there." And yeah, sure enough. So I have that in common with Nairobi, it sounds like, here in Nashville, Tennessee. You just never know. Well, we would love to hear more about your ministry work as well. Can you share a story from your ministry work that shows the impact made on the people in your community?
Yeah, so I told you about the orphanage that we inherited, me and Eunice, which is the Lord, again. But we inherited this orphanage, and once we realized that most of the kids had families, we took them home to the families, and we subsequently began rescuing children from the streets. So now how we kind of operate is that we rescue about 100 kids from the streets every year. We bring them in as they're ready. We provide them with rehabilitation services like counseling and life skills, and then we start looking for their family. Once we've found their family, we prepare their family through, economic empowerment, counseling, parenting skills. As we're preparing the child, then we reunite them. And so sometimes that just leads to the coolest situations. Sometimes it's really hard. There's really difficult family issues or really scary reasons that they left or whatever. But sometimes I get reports on my phone every day about kids who've gone home. And a while back, we had a kid who had been rescued from the streets. He had been on the streets for several years. He went through the first 30 days of our rehabilitation program. And then our social worker got on public transportation. So that would be a motorbike and then a little minibus. And they went out far, far, far to where his village was. And they showed up in the village. And somebody started shouting that the kid was home. And the mom had gone to the police station. She had gone to the mortuary. She thought her child was dead. And so she literally called the whole village together to have a impromptu worship service that her son, who she thought was dead, was still alive and was rescued. And just the stories like that and the gospel implications of what it means to have a restored family and a restored life are just, I don't know, so deeply encouraging and help on the hard days. But you can just imagine just kind of the joy in that mother's heart that her son got home, and even the joy in that son's heart that, whatever mistake that he had made that made him leave home was forgiven. And obviously you think about the prodigal son
Right.
In that story. But yeah, ministry is really beautiful sometimes.
Yes, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it made me think immediately of the prodigal son. Like you almost got to see that just played out in real life in modern times, and that's really beautiful.
Yeah. That's my passion. Is obviously my first calling was to work with street children in Kenya. Like that's a very specific calling. But then my secondary calling was that we inherited this orphanage. We went there. We started rescuing kids. And at some point we remained with 5 kids that we couldn't find family for. And 2 of them I had known their mother. And so we started fostering them. And that was a secondary calling in my life because we began fostering them through the local government, and they would come to us on the weekends. So they would come spend the weekend at our house, and then on Monday we would take them back to the orphanage. And it began this, I don't even know how to describe, this torture in my heart of this child who I've begun to love and care for. Who's checking him in tonight? Who's asking about his day? Who's saying prayers with him? Who's giving him a hug? And so it was the secondary calling that I want to see all kids in safe, loving families. And unfortunately, I think as believers, when we've built or funded or visited orphanages, what we don't realize is that sometimes we are actually creating orphans where there may have been kids in a poor family, and we could have redirected those resources to help that family become secure so that that child could be with their mom. So that's my heart, and my secondary calling is that my work with Send Relief, I really just want to see all kids in safe, loving families because of that experience and because of the heartbreak in that. I know that that's women's hearts too. We're mothers.
Yeah.
You think about your kids, and we can lead that charge through how we give, through how we share that story, through how we advocate for those kids. And so, yeah, any opportunity I have, that's the thing. That's my platform. That's the thing I want to shout about is that there are between 6 and 8 million kids in orphanages that could be in families. And there's more than 150 million kids on the streets. And so, like you said, not everyone is called to come over to Kenya,
Right.
but everyone can be called to pray in the right way for those kids and advocate for them, both, through their influence, through their giving, and even just in how they think about that and ask the Lord for mercy in those ways.
Kristen, so many times we hear, pray, give, and go, like specifically, like how can you be involved? Because you can be involved.
Mm-hmm.
It's a choice, though, you have to choose to, and we all can be involved in some way. And I think you touched on this a lot in what you just said, but how can listeners pray specifically for missionaries and their families? How can they partner with them in their work? And I do think sometimes when we think about go, it's like, well, I can't, I'm not going to go live overseas. But there are short-term trips all the time, which stabilize and invigorate and encourage people who have put their lives in a whole different part of the world. But can you give just maybe some tangible ways that people can support? But then also, what are some specific prayer points that you would just say, this is like, start praying for us, and then start maybe praying for yourself about what it is that God would ask of you for how you get involved?
One very specific thing is that through Send Relief, we're starting orphan care vision trips. So we've had one, and we are launching them. And if you or your church would like to come over and learn about what it looks like to care for orphans in kind of a practical way, we're inviting churches, missionaries, and leaders of organizations. So if you serve on the board of an organization, you give to an organization, to come over and spend 5 days on the ground, kind of learning about how can we care for orphans well. And when you leave that trip, you'll be equipped with all the resources and understanding to become an advocate for an orphan. And if your church goes on a trip like that and says, you know what, like, this is where God is calling us, we want to serve orphans, we want to connect you to a local church here where you can work with the local church in their community through a partnership to make sure that kids don't have to leave home. So you can prevent kids from becoming orphans by strengthening families through the local church. So that's one incredibly practical thing. If you're interested in that, you can reach out to me. I'd be happy to share more. We're scheduling those trips now. As far as praying, pray for encouragement for missionaries. It's wonderful. I absolutely love my life here in Kenya, but also it's heavy.
Mm-hmm.
You've chosen to put yourself in the midst of a lot of messy relationships, a lot of messy things. There is not the option as much to insulate yourself here as there might be in other places in the world. You come face to face with really difficult things on a regular basis. So praying for missionaries, especially in the global South, that they will not become hard-hearted, that we will not become cynical, that we will continue to see the needs and the people that the Lord puts in front of us, even when we're exhausted,
Mm-hmm.
because exhaustion is a real part of the human experience.
Right.
I've got 4 kids at home, and sometimes I'm just like, oh, really, right now? Do we have to? So pray for missionaries to continue to keep seeing those things and to keep, just having open eyes to where the Lord is working around us. But you can pray for yourself in that way too. Put yourself in situations where you're coming into contact with people who need to know the Lord's love, whether that's through local tutoring or refugees in your community, or your benevolence ministry at your church, or whatever it is. Be intentional about putting yourself and your children and your family in places where they're going to come across needs, be that physical or spiritual or emotional, and then be willing to sacrifice comfort and money and time to get into those messy relationships, because I think that's where real gospel change happens, is in the context of deep relationships, which is hard. I'm an introvert. My husband's an introvert. We're both introverts. And it's hard sometimes, but I really do think that the Lord created us to be in community and to, see change in ourselves and in the world through those kinds of relationships.
I love that. Thank you for sharing those tips. And we'll have more information in the show notes for people if they want to get in touch with you and all of those things. Well, this is the Marked podcast. So we are going to ask our question. What has marked you in your walk with Christ? And Ashley, I'm going to let you answer this first because you have not been on the Marked podcast before. So we need to hear your answer.
I would say God's kindness. There's so many facets of who God is, but just how kind he is. And I think that broaches like all seasons of my life, and just even the kindness of being on this with someone I've known half of my life.
Yeah.
And so it's just, he's so good and just beautiful with how he just shows us more of who he is and how he's working in the whole world, but how he still just loves us. And I just keep coming back to that. And I think I've grown more into that. The older I get, I just see how kind he is and how he has always been so kind, just in my story and in those around me.
I love that. Kristen, what about you? What is one way that God has marked you in your walk with Christ?
I mean, amen to Ashley. And I think we're on the same brain wavelength, because I was driving home from work today, just kind of pondering that. And the word loving kindness is also what kept coming to my mind. His loving kindness to me in really practical ways, a husband, children, and, an institution that was just given to me, but also in community. Like, I think back to right after college, I had sort of a crisis of faith, and had gentle shepherds in my life. I had this one pastor who I was struggling with my faith really hard. And every Sunday after church, he didn't lecture me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me and said, Jesus loves you and he died for your sins. Every Sunday without fail. And that just gentle, loving kindness. When I'm not faithful, he is faithful. And as Ashley said, like, the older you get, the more you can look back on it and just see his goodness and kindness to you. And so, yeah.
Well, that is great. And thank you so much, both of you, for being on the podcast. Ashley for co-hosting with me, and Kristen for calling in from Kenya. We are so grateful to get to talk to you, and for our listeners to know about the work that you are doing in Kenya and around the world, and how they can help, because I know a lot of them are thinking, I didn't think that I would be able to help orphans in Kenya, and now they have a path to do that. And so we're so grateful for the work that you do and for you taking the time to be on the podcast today. And listeners, we will be back next week with a new episode. So we'll talk to you then. Marked is a production of Lifeway Podcast, produced by Aaron Franklin. It's recorded at the Lifeway Podcast Studio in Brentwood, Tennessee, and engineered by Donnie Gordon with help from Nathan Howard. Edited by William Hall with art by Leanne Dans. And I'm your host, Elizabeth Hyndman. Meet me back here next week. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can find us on social media at Lifeway Women. Today's show notes will be posted at lifewaywomen.com/marked. If you enjoy the show, leave us a review.
Hi, friends. I'm Jennifer Rothschild, and I want to invite you to join me for the Prepare Him Room virtual event this Christmas season. This time is going to be filled with worship led by Michael O'Brien, plus encouragement and teaching that is going to draw your heart to Jesus. So whether you're watching on your own or with a small group or hosting the event at your church, I know that you will discover the joy of Jesus' birth all over again. Register today at lifeway.com/preparehimroom. That's lifeway.com/preparehimroom.